again, I'm going to try to give you a broad overview of I think the things that are most important to know about this data set to be able to analyze it efficiently, effectively. Again, my name's Ben Bowyer. I've been involved with this project since 2011. Not quite, to correct for the record, since we're being filmed, not quite since the inception of this project, but I joined the research team, the Civic Engagement Research Group, which at the time was based in Oakland at Mills College, in 2011, so shortly before the first wave of data came in. So I came aboard while the first survey was still out in the field. I've been, not unlike Sisyphus, pushing around that boulder of a Codebook pretty much ever since. So I can go into a lot of details about a lot of these things. Again, I'm going to focus today on just the real bare bones of what you need to know to work specifically with the 2013 Wave 2 data set that hopefully most of you got from David, but I'll also highlight some things about Waves 1 and 3, similarities between the waves, some important differences in methodology as well. So I'll give you a brief overview, first of all, about how the data were collected. Then I'll turn to a description of the quite complicated sampling procedures that were used, which is all background for the next part, which is about the survey weights, how to use them. If you walk away from the next 20 minutes with nothing else, the take-home point is use the survey weights if you want to make inferences to the population. I'm going to tell you which survey weights you need to use, how to use them. And then just a couple pointers about what to look for in the Codebook, how to look for it, as well as how the data file itself is structured, and specifically about some of the derived variables, the variables that were supplied by the vendor, that the variable descriptions may or may not make sense to a normal human being. So I'll try to give a little bit of context that I think, again, will be generally useful to most of you in this room. And again, we'll save the last half hour or so for topic specific to particular projects. All right. So as Joe's mentioned, the survey was fielded over 3 waves between 2011 and 2015. The first sample was of, our population started off as 15 to 25-year-olds. We realized that before Wave 2, fortunately, that our population was aging as we proceeded with these waves. So you note here that the upper range of our target population increases by increments of 2 years each time. That way we kept the oldest people in our original sample within the target population. Note as well, we keep this lowest age at 15. So we have a new batch of 15 and 16-year-olds at each wave of the survey. Waves 2 and Wave 2 and 3 contain some respondents who took previous waves of the survey. Joe's mentioned that before, as well as fresh samples. So again, we will release the panel data set, hopefully early in the new year. We also have 3 standalone cross-sectional nationally representative samples of youth in each of these years. All 3 waves were administered by what the firm that started out in 2011 as Knowledge Network. We were in this process was long enough that several multinational mergers later, the firm is now GFK, or by the end was GFK. I think they might have undergone further corporate consolidation in the interim. The Waves 1 and Wave 2 were administered primarily online, but also with a phone component. Wave 3 was entirely online. All 3 waves of the survey were administered in both English and Spanish language versions. Just a bit more depth here about survey mode. So the GFK specializes in online surveys, but given the complexity of our sample, which I'll go into in a bit, we supplemented the online surveys with some telephone interviews as well. That was a much bigger part of the Wave 1 sample. With the Wave 2 data that we're giving you today, there's just over 100 respondents who took the survey over a phone with a live interviewer. There was no phone interviewing at all in Wave 3. If you're working with the Wave 1 data, there are some mode effects, different patterns of response depending on whether the survey was completed online or on the phone. John Renegowski and I have a paper on that in Political Research and Methods, if you really want to look into that further. So, for example, political knowledge items we were looking at earlier on, we get a lot more don't knows on the online survey than we did on the telephone survey. Telephone survey, people will give you an answer, whether they know it or not. Some of those people will randomly choose the right answer to those questions. So it looks like the phone respondents know more about politics than the online respondents, but that's actually just because they're guessing more frequently than the online respondents. So anything that could be confounded by survey mode, you need to be careful about with the Wave 1 data set. It's not as big a problem with the Wave 2 data since the phone component is a much smaller part, but my recommendation would be to at least throw survey mode in a control if you're running a multivariate analysis. It can't hurt to include that in your model. The Wave 2 survey took about, I think the median response time for Wave 2 was 30 minutes online, 40 minutes on the phone. So it's quite a lengthy survey, again, especially if you're on the phone for better part of an hour. The language breakdown. So respondents who identified as Hispanic or Latino were given the option of taking the survey in either the English or Spanish language version. It varies a little bit by the wave of the survey, but roughly 20% of Latino respondents took the survey in Spanish. In Wave 2, I think it was 17% took the Spanish language survey. Everybody else took the survey in English. So this is where we start to get a little more complicated as we turn to the sampling plan. So the original design was to stratify the survey by age and by race ethnicity. The reason for this was, first of all, the desire to have oversamples of minority groups. And so that's the reason for the stratification by race ethnicity. The second reason was there is particular interest in the youngest age group amongst our target population. That is, we wanted to make sure that we got a decent enough size sample of teenagers to be able to do analyses of that group. So the Wave 1 sample, you'll see, was stratified. So 4 racial ethnic groups, 3 age categories. We, by and large, kept that design across Waves 2 and Waves 3, though you'll notice that in Waves, and I would add again, in Wave 1, we tried to select equal size samples from each of those 12 age race strata. In Wave 2, we added kind of a residual category of people who identified with none of those racial groups or identified with multiple racial groups to make sure that we weren't leaving out a portion of the population. That group was not oversampled, but so it's not an equal-sized stratum as the others, but it allows us to generalize to the overall population of 15 to 27-year-olds in Wave 2 and 15 to 29-year-olds in wave 3. You notice that the age bands change a little bit, again, as the age of our survey respondents change slightly. We kept the youngest band, the youngest age strata, the same in all 3 waves, again, to make sure that we had sufficient statistical power to be able to look at, high school aged youth in all 3 waves. So, as I mentioned, the survey was collected by GFK and largely relies on their existing online panel of respondents. But given the target population that we were interested in, we had to have a more creative sampling plan and more complicated one. So first of all, as we've mentioned before, for the wave 2 sample in particular, we attempted to recontact all wave 1 respondents. So drawing from the wave 1 sample, we ended up with over 700 respondents who took both wave 1 and wave 2. We'll talk about why that retention rate was lower than we'd hoped in a minute. So yeah, roughly a third or so of the wave 2 sample had also taken wave 1. We then drew a fresh sample original to wave 2 that was drawn from 3 sources, or 3 different types. The first 2 draw on Knowledge Network GFK's knowledge panel, right? Their proprietary internet-based panel. The third source was unique to our survey when it was an address-based sampling. How many of you are familiar with GFK surveys and their methodology? Okay, so about half. So I guess the important things to know is that they have a probability-based panel that they send online surveys to on an ongoing basis. So if you're a member of this panel and they've been recruited, I think first they used random digit dialing sampling. More recently, they've done an address-based approach. But people have a known probability of being in their massive online panel, and these panelists get sent or asked to participate in surveys on, several times a month. They get, I think there's some sort of incentive system. It's like a point-based system. There may be cash prizes, et cetera, for participation. The advantage of GFK's approach is it is probability-based rather than opt-in panels that many, especially early internet panels, were. The problem for our research project, though, was at the time, GFK's panel only included adults, so people U.S. residents aged 18 or older, so that didn't let us get at the 15 to 17-year-olds, obviously. GFK's panel at the time also did not have enough members, especially young African American and Asian American youth. So we had to have these additional samples. So one additional sample was drawn from the knowledge panel, and for each of their panelists, they have they know everything about these people in their panels, right? So they know if their panelists have children in the household that fit our target population, right? So we drew a sample from parents who are known to have children in the target 15 to 25, 15 to 27 age range, and that was the second big source of our sample. For our white sample, those 2 sources were sufficient. Especially for our African American and Asian American samples, even with the parents of young people included, there still weren't going to be enough of a pool to draw on for our purposes. So that's where that third source comes in. And this is a unique address-based sample for our survey. The way that this worked, the sampling frames here were drawn from the U.S. Postal Service's the delivery sequence file, and GFK contracted to an outside vendor which identified households that were likely to fit the demographics that we were looking for. As there were reason to believe that there were members of our target population in these households. So for the Asian and Latino samples, using this ABS approach, this relied largely on surnames, which has problems, especially for the Asian sample I'll go into in a minute. The African American, to target African American households or target households that were believed to contain African American youth, they relied on census data on the racial the demographics of the census tract, basically. So these addresses were sampled, invitation letters were sent to these households. There's also a residual group, but I'll stop going into those weeds now. Households were sent an invitation letter, explained the survey, is bilingual, what we were trying to do, invited people to participate, gave them a link to the website, a web address, as well as a unique personal identification number they could use when they log in. Those letters went out. A few weeks later, a reminder postcard went out. A couple of reminders came out. After a few more weeks, there were follow-up with phone calls. So households that didn't initially respond, but they could obtain phone numbers for a live interviewer called the home to try to get it complete. So that sample, they took a screener to determine whether there was an eligible person in the household, and if there was, got parental consent, and that young person was, again, either online or over the phone asked to complete the survey. Yeah, how this looks in wave 2. The first column there shows the waves 1 and 3 use similar procedures to draw the unique sample. So the first column there shows for the 728 people who responded both to waves 1 and wave 2 what the original sample source was. What you'll note there is that the number of responses for wave 1 respondents drawn from our parent sample is really low. There was a programming error made by GFK so that when the follow-up surveys went out, they forgot to say, pass the computer to your kid who took the survey 2 years ago. Yeah. So for that reason, that's the big reason why our wave 1, wave 2 panel is problematic. For our younger age groups in particular, that parents' sample was a big source, or 15 to 18-year-olds. I think our wave 1, wave 2 panel be okay if you're looking at older youth, so say 19 to 25-year-olds at the time of wave 1. That would probably still be nationally representative, but certainly for the younger age groups in our sample, the wave 1, wave 2 panel became useless. That's how we ended up with wave 3, which is the good news, but it was a bit of a headache at the time. Again, there's a description of the wave 2 fresh panel as well. One thing I didn't mention, you see the grandparents line. Wave 2, we had particular problems obtaining large enough samples of African American teenagers and Asian Americans in all three of our age strata. One supplemental sample that was used there was GFK pulled people who were grandparents, African Americans who had grandchildren, and they were sampled and asked if they had grandkids who were in our target age range, and if so, could they please take our survey. We got another, I think, 17 respondents through that method. We only used that approach in the Wave 2 survey. So if you see our final numbers broken down by our three strata, we were able to reach, we were aiming for, oh, go ahead, please.
What kind of assurances do they provide that the children actually took the survey and not the parent as a child?
Yeah. Are the ways to check it? Not really, is the short answer. People were asked their birth date and age and filled it in, and we didn't get people outside that range. So if they were lying, at least they were consistent in their lying throughout our survey. But yeah, it's an online survey. We don't know who was actually at the keyboard.
And was an additional financial incentive given when it's given to the child?
So
If you're doing two surveys in your household, it's not much pay you more.
So it varies by which sample you're from, and there were additional incentives for the hardest to reach groups. That's in the Codebook, and I couldn't answer that exactly off the top of my head. But it does vary, and there are incentives. So yeah. So we were targeting about 200 from for each of these strata. So we were able to meet these targets for the various white and Latino groups, for the older African American strata as well. But again, as I mentioned before, we struggled to meet the target numbers for the younger teenage African Americans and especially the Asian American groups. Yeah.
Is this sampling strategy made clear in the available data? Like, are we able to discern which people were sampled by through their parents?
Yes, there's a variable that indicates, there are variables. I'll show you the data file. It's at the top of the data file. There are a number of variables that indicate the sample. So yeah, if you want to control for sample. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, as Joe mentioned before, we did have concerns about how representative this Asian sample ended up being. Right, for one thing, right, there was, the survey was administered only in English and Spanish. The address-based sampling approach relied on last names. There are confounding names like Lee that don't neatly work for that approach. If you look at the distribution of, it's a question about national origin as well. If you look at the distribution there, it looks like certain national origin groups were more likely to be in the survey than others. There are very few Filipino or Korean respondents in particular, just perusing the data. So again, we put a lot of expense into trying to get this oversample of Asian Americans, but we're not confident in the end that this group is representative of Asian American youth, unfortunately. Okay, since we're at 5 o'clock and my big point today was weight the data, I'll get to that point. Be sure to weight the data if you're going to make inferences to the overall population of 15 to 27-year-olds. I hope I didn't make that point too subtle on this slide. Basically, without going in, there's much more description about this procedure in the Codebook. The weights account for the unequal probability of selection. There also is a post-stratification weighting to match so that the final weighted survey matches up with the 2013 current population survey benchmarks on a variety of demographic variables. Once you've applied those weights, it miraculously, our sample does look like national population. There are two weighting variables that are included in the data set that you're getting today. They're called weight 3 and weight 4. Weights 1 and 2, if you were wondering, have to do with the panel data set that you're not getting today. Weight 3 is the weight you want to use if you're doing analysis of the overall population of 15 to 27-year-olds. Weight 4 would be used only if you're analyzing a specific racial or ethnic group, right? If you're just interested in Latino political attitudes or African American political behavior, you should use weight 4. But again, if you're interested in the entire population of 15 to 27-year-olds, use that first weight 3 variable. And again, this slide shows what our unweighted sample looks like and then compares it to the weighted sample. You see most obviously the unweighted size of the minority groups that we oversampled is large relative to their actual share of the population. Once weight 3 is applied, they mirror what the CPS tells us the population looks like. You notice our raw data, unweighted data looked pretty good in terms of educational attainment. So we were getting youth of various levels of socioeconomic status, even without weighting. Again, it looks obviously even more representative once the weights are applied. Same thing applies to household income. Gender, we had somewhat more female than male respondents. Again, that's taken care of through the weighting. Codebook, I think most of you got that via email. Just a couple very quick notes about that. The questionnaire itself, so our questions start on, it's page number 49. It's the 52nd page of the PDF, and it goes through page 70, which is the 73rd page of the PDF. That's where the items that we wrote are unique to our survey appear. I think those are most of the things that would be of most interest to most of you. The few pages before that, the few pages after that in the Codebook are basically programming instructions, how the derived variables were created, all sorts of muckety-muck that you probably don't want to deal with unless you have to. Note that also that the Codebook has in basically the programming instructions in bold brackets. So there are some questions that are only asked, like the mobilization question. If people said yes, there were a couple follow-up questions. If they said no, those questions got skipped over. So those programming instructions will alert you to that. Final thing to show you is the data set itself. So the questions that we asked are, again, start about Q1 and go through Q150 something. The first one have to do with the derived variables supplied by the vendor. First ones describe which sample the respondent comes off of, et cetera. At the very end, what I want to point your attention to is these other demographic variables, which again were provided to us by GFK. Some of these variables pertain to the individual survey respondent, and some of the variables pertain to their household. And how you interpret this variable depends on which sample someone came from, right? For people drawn from the direct panel, right, the 18 to 27-year-olds who came off the knowledge panel, they provided these responses about their household. For the youth recruited through our unique ABS sample, they also were asked these questions. They provided these answers. For youth who came from the parent sample, right, their parent was the person who was on the knowledge panel. The household variables are their parents' responses. So when you look at the survey, you'll see that 70% of 15-year-olds in our survey say that they're the head of their household. Before you start to try to make sense of what it is about millennials or post-millennials, whatever you call them, most of those heads of households are actually their parents, right? So be careful working with those household variables in particular to avoid any of those mistakes. I'd also note at the very bottom, some of these variables have been imputed, so you see 2 education variables, 2 income variables, et cetera. One has impute at the end. These are the variables that were used for the post-stratification weights. So whenever there is missing data, knowledge networks imputed a value for every respondent. Otherwise, the weighting wouldn't work. For people coming off the knowledge panel, their values may have been imputed already. We wouldn't know. For that reason, so this really only makes a difference for the people coming off of our address-based sample. So I would invite, just for consistency's sake, I usually use these imputed values. In most cases, there's not a lot of missing data in the first place for these variables, exception being household income. Yeah, in our work, I usually use the imputed values. Final question, final variable to point out, the household internet access variable. These people are taking the survey online, right? Knowledge Network GFK gives people who don't have internet access as part of the incentive to sign up with their survey. So for people drawn from this knowledge panel, if they say no, again, that's a head scratcher. That meant at the time they were asked to participate in the knowledge panel originally, did their household have internet access or not? Again, that's just one of the complexities of this survey, these data.
I know we're going to need this later. Weight 3 versus weight 4. Thank you for generating separate weights for the specific groups, but how mathematically define that framework?
So you're going to get, so say you were just interested in Latino attitudes again, you're going to get the same point estimates whether you use weight 3 or weight 4. Your standard errors are going to tend to be lower if you use weight 4. That is, weight 4 accounts for the stratification by race in a way that tends to give you more statistical power. Again, if you're looking at all youth, if you use weight 4 instead of weight 3, your point estimates will be messed up because there is an oversampling of certain groups and undersampling of other groups. So again, in terms of point estimates, you're never going to be wrong if you use weight 3. But if you are, again, just analyzing one particular group, weight 4 will give you possibly some more statistical power.
Follow up one briefly. So if you, weight 4, you want to do analysis for Asian Americans or Japanese Americans, use that particular weight, is it specific to the ethnic groups or just Asian Americans?
It's specific to Asian Americans, yeah. And again, we're, yep.
I mean, do you want to say something, Ben, about, I mean, especially with Asians, there's some categories where 2 kids are counting for an awful lot of people.
Yeah, this is really deep in the weeds, but like we had few Asian American youth who came off of the direct sample from the knowledge panel. Their weights tend to be really high. So if you happen to be, you know, like a random 21-year-old who identified as Asian American and hadn't completed high school, you get like this really high weight, whereas somebody drawn from the address-based sample, because their probability of selection was so much higher, they would get this really low weight. So, you know, you're getting a handful of, with the weights apply, a handful of individuals who are having a pretty big effect on the results. So, yeah, we banged our heads against that a lot with wave 1. And waves 2 and 3, we just shied away from trying to make any generalizations about Asian Americans. Okay, other general questions, or hopefully have some time now for people to go back to start exploring the data and any specific questions they might have about their projects and how you might use your data for your own purposes.
Yeah, I think what, just by way of sort of moving, you know, we have another 20 minutes or so. We're going to hang out and would love to answer any specific questions you have, chance to talk with others. We would love people to fill out the evaluation. We would love for you, if you haven't yet gotten a thumb drive but want it, to fill out the data use agreement and get that. But we won't do a formal wrap-up, except to say we know this was a bit of an endurance test, and so we really appreciate all of you hanging in there with us to learn about this. And we're eager to stay connected, obviously through this afternoon, but in the future if we can be helpful.
Yeah, and are very excited at the prospect of you all, or some subset of you all, using these data. So yeah, we look forward hopefully to seeing lots of great work coming out of this.